All right, so once again, everyone, welcome to Smartphone Photography. Today we're going to be talking about composition basics, which is basically how to frame your picture and lay it out. So let's go ahead and get started. Some of the composition techniques that we're going to be covering today include lighting, perspective, leading line, and the rule of thirds. Since every camera is a little bit different and the settings are different and we are in this virtual setting, we're going to talk about general concepts, and that's where we'll spend the bulk of our time. Usually when we teach this class in person, we have everyone bring their smartphones and we can get a little hands-on experience digging into the settings. I'm going to try to do that as much as possible today, so that's also something we'll get into. Once we talk about the theory, we'll drill down into the specifics of our devices, and then our ultimate objective for today is to learn how to take better pictures. Okay, so before we get started, there's just a couple quotes that we love. Quote number one is, "The best camera is the one you have with you." And that was said by photographer Chase Jarvis. The reason we like that in this context is because oftentimes we think of great pictures as requiring big, fancy, expensive cameras. But if you don't have that camera with you and you can't take a picture, then that camera is not doing you any good. So there's wonderful things about those nice DSLRs or digital SLR cameras. But the thing about smartphones is that we usually have something like this with us in our pocket, in our purse, in our bag, in our car, that we can just take a quick shot real quick if we happen to be inspired by a sunset or a rainbow or a book we're reading, a quote. So those are some fun things about the smartphone and having that with you. And then as we talk about these photography concepts, it's also important to remember to learn the rules so we know when to break them. Everything we cover today is simply suggestion and tools for you to learn. But of course, the wonderful thing about digital photography is that it doesn't cost us any money to take a bad picture. And so we can practice all we want. We can go by the rule book and then break it, and we just see which one we like. Like any art, photography is fairly subjective, and so think about things that you like and then apply the rules accordingly. So with our basic composition, like I was saying, we're going to cover rule of thirds first, then we're going to switch to perspective. We'll talk a little bit about leading lines, and then we'll finish up with lighting. So we tried to kind of pick some of the more important photography composition techniques. First technique is going to be the rule of thirds. And this is a really big one that you might not know about. It's pretty subtle. But the rule of thirds basically is the idea that our brains are somehow more interested in an image that is slightly off center. That technique draws the viewer, so you or I, into the picture a little bit more. So if you compare the top picture with the bottom picture, both wonderful photographs, but the top picture is a rock sticking out of the sand with some other rocks behind it and like a cool sky. The bottom picture makes me wonder kind of what's off to the side of that rock. Like I was saying, I don't know the technical reasons why our brains find that more interesting, but that's kind of where the rule of thirds has come into place. And just to break that down a little bit more, it's called the rule of thirds because it basically splits your frame into 3 sections, both vertically and also 3 sections horizontally. And so sometimes you might even see your camera looking like that. And we'll show you how to get that setting on your camera if you want it. But when you're framing a picture, you're gonna want to try, you should try having the subject of your picture slightly off to the side and kind of along those those intersecting points of where the vertical lines meet the horizontal lines. So it looks like a tic-tac-toe board. So you'll see this tree, okay? This is a great tree, and if I took a picture with the tree dead center, it would be beautiful. But the tree happens to be on the left-hand third of the picture, the bulk of the tree. And again, that's just a more interesting photograph for our brains. You'll notice too the horizon. So if we think about that vertical third, okay, the sky and the horizon's down at the bottom, and it's taking up less than a third there, and the sky is kind of the top third. So just to kind of cover a couple other examples here, we've got this, Stephanie, is that a cheetah?
I believe it is a cheetah.
Okay.
I just took this, I borrowed this picture just because it's so dynamic. I mean, it not only goes with the rule of thirds, but this is really getting into some art stuff. There's the thing called the golden ratio. And if you start from the lower right corner of the screen and kind of circle your way up and around, going from lower right, going to the left, lower left, curving upward to the upper left, and then continuing, it gives a nice kind of like a flow. So if it like kind of like a wave, so it directs your eyes and it leads it around the canvas. So that's another reason why you want to consider the rule of thirds, is just to make it more interesting to your eye. So it's not just in one place, your eye is moving around the canvas.
That's a great way to say it. Yeah. So that's kind of the part that your brain finds more interesting, your eye finds more interesting. I talked about those intersecting points of the horizontal and vertical lines. So here we've got those examples of them. We can call them PowerPoints, but that's going to be where you want to try the bold focus of your subject. That's going to be where we're naturally drawn to. And you'll see even that animal, I'm just going to call it an animal. You'll see that animal's face is turned and looking off. And so we're wondering, what's he looking at? I feel like I can almost see it in this picture. And I like what Stephanie said about keeping your eye moving too. You're not just looking at it once and then ready for the next picture. All right, so now that you know about the rule of thirds, if you'd never heard of it before, I had never heard of it until I started learning about photography, but I see it everywhere now. I don't know if anybody even reads magazines anymore, but I know when I flip through a magazine, because we get some here at the library, when I flip through it, I see that rule of thirds. I see professional photographers using that technique, and I never even knew about it. So just a really good way of making your pictures more interesting without needing much skill. It's literally just moving your camera so that whatever you want to take a picture of is slightly off center. So keep an eye out for it. Social media, books, of course, our librarians here, we're going to encourage you to look for stuff in books. Yeah. Sunsets and sunrises. That used to be a big one that people take pictures of. Sometimes when we take a picture, we've got the sunset and it's beautiful and there's a line, and we put the line in the very middle of our camera. So the sky is the top half and the ocean maybe is the bottom half. Next time you take a picture of a sunset like that, try making the sky the upper 2/3. Or the ocean, the bottom 2/3 of the horizon, just to kind of give it a little bit more interest there, and you'll see the difference that it makes. Okay, so this is where we would usually break out and practice these on our own. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I do just want to actually, let me turn my camera back on. I do just want to show you, if you want to, there's a setting on most mobile devices, whether you have an Apple phone or an Android phone, that will let you add that grid as a visual reminder to your camera. If you have an iPhone, you're going to go into your settings app, which is that gray gear symbol. And then you're going to scroll all the way down to your camera app. And in the camera app, there's an option that says grid, and you'll just turn that on. And now when I open my camera, I don't want to be in it, you'll see those grid lines. And I'm sorry, I don't know if you can see it, but those grid lines are on that. It's not going to be on your picture, but it will just be there in your viewfinder to help you. Those of you that have an Android device, you're going to start in your camera app. Then you're going to go into the settings. So when you open up your camera, there's probably a little gear icon somewhere in there. You'll tap on that gear icon to open up your settings. The Android device that I have, there's a second step that you have. I had to go to a little wrench section of my settings and turn my guidelines on there. So same thing, just called different words and access different ways, but try turning it on and seeing if it helps you take better pictures. Because that's what's so great about these smartphones. They have all these great settings in there that just help us get better at photography. So, any questions about rule of thirds? And I should say, just as a heads up, anytime we get to one of these pink slides, we're gonna pause for questions. So feel free to start typing them into the chat box. Okay, and if there's any questions that come through a little bit later, we can always cover them at the end. Oops, that's my mouse. Okay, so the next technique we're gonna talk about is called perspective. Okay, and this is one that I use all the time because people are like, oh, your pictures are so interesting. And what I like to do is I like to create a foreground and then a background. And what it does to your picture is makes it a little more three-dimensional for the viewer. So instead of this window, for example, if I was standing at this window before I learned about this technique, I would stand right up in the window and take a picture of the view. And I'm sure it would be a beautiful picture. But if I take a step back and get that frame in there, what that's going to do is that's going to remind me what it was like to stand in that spot. And it's going to let other people experience that same thing of having that frame, that stone arch and the windows that open, and that beautiful view that it leads out to. So it creates a bit of depth and it really draws your viewer in. I like to use it to tell a bit of a story too, and that's what the fun pictures are, at least in some contexts. I do more landscape than other things, but the framing gives that option of that storytelling. You can kind of give it a little bit more more details are in the picture. Okay, and then you can decide what to focus on too. So I thought this was a really pretty picture. And just so you all know, I did not take any of these pictures, but I did choose them and they're all used with permission. We have the links and we'll be sending them out when we send out the slides to you all next week. But you'll see this picture is of a pathway, and I really liked that the small little weed flowers were in focus, but the stone pathway behind it and the trees were slightly out of focus too. So when I think about perspective, it forces me to kind of stop and think about things from a different perspective, a different angle. Again, you can use it to tell a story, just depending on what the focus of your subject will be in your picture. You'll see this guy. This is this definitely tells a story of being lost somewhere and a little bit confused, and you don't know where, but the focus is on his expression and his emotion. And again, with perspective, try taking a picture from a different angle. This picture is of a cobblestone street. To me, it looks like San Juan, probably. But I love that we're seeing the cobblestones at the bottom of the screen. It's not often that I sit down or lay down and take a picture or get that perspective. And so this just brought a really unique way to show the cobblestone. So if you're ever trying to just see a different perspective, try standing on a bench. In fact, I did that the other day, taking a picture at one of our local parks as I stood on a bench, and it just was able to give me like a little bit better shot than what I was getting just standing on the ground. So just another thing to keep in mind to experiment with. Okay, and that's a little bit about perspective. Nothing I can show you on your phones that'll help you with that, but just again, as you're going about your day, as you're going to take a picture, thinking about ways to make it a little more interesting, maybe some framing. What happens if you hold it up over your head, your phone? What about when you lower it down, take a step forward, take a step back? How much of your subject do you want in the frame? How much of the background do you want? So different things to tell an interesting story. All right, any questions on perspective? Or Stephanie, if you want to chime in, you're welcome to.
No, I think you pretty much covered it. From the artistic, from the really technical standpoint, the red flower, the shot with the red flower is really good, because it shows a couple of things. It shows the rule of thirds, number one, because your eye is drawn right to that red, and because the red stands out so much from the rest of the fairly kind of earthy, tony view, and then you look and see, oh, there's red, so that's exactly where your eye's going to go. The other thing is that is a trick, and I think you're going over this next with the next topic, but it's also talking about depth of field, with shallow depth of field versus I forget, it's narrow depth of field versus wide depth of field, I think it is. I get them confused. But if it's short like that, you're going to notice, the object is going to be much clearer. Your subject is going to be much clearer than whatever's in the distance, like the one with the gentleman in the map. That's a really good example also of foreground, middle ground, and background layering in photography, because you can focus on any one of those levels and it's going to give you a completely different view of the photo.
Awesome. Yeah, great. And that's the perspective that I like, is the foreground, middle ground, and background too. So just things to think about as you play around and experiment. Maybe you find a different perspective that you really like. I forgot to mention for people, because I don't have a lot of people shots in here, but maybe take a picture of little kids are playing on the ground instead of taking a picture of them like from your side. Maybe go over them and take a picture just straight down. Or food. I'm terrible at food pictures, so I'm constantly trying to practice. I'm not getting any better. I don't know. Maybe I need to just research a little bit, but yeah, so all these different things to try when you're taking pictures. All right, let's go ahead and talk about leading lines. Leading lines kind of could be tied in with perspective, but it's basically using symmetry to create these bold images. I love this picture on the right. Again, I didn't take it, but because it pulls you in, it just feels like I could take one step and be right on that bridge right there, going all the way into as far as I can see. And we refer to that as a vanishing point too. So leading lines are basically lines that go and lead you somewhere. Very cleverly named. I think we live in a great town to practice this technique, because we have so many bridges here that are so beautiful, and offer us great opportunities to practice leading lines. This beach little walk, not only does the fence and the stairs give leading lines, but then the shadow within that is on the ground to offer additional leading lines. So just a few ideas here on the left for things to think about if you wanted to practice this concept. Maybe something we don't have is stairs, but trails, like the picture we just saw, trains, railroad tracks, roads, escalators. Sometimes you probably can picture a bold image of multiple escalators that is many people have taken. Excuse me, I'm gonna have to take a sip of water. All right. And then, of course, my favorite leading lines are going to be bookshelves. Of course, I'm biased because I'm a librarian, but just another example of some opportunities to practice leading lines. So when you're taking pictures, when you're out and about, look for those opportunities for symmetry, and then ask yourself, where are those lines directing me? Where does it want me to go? Where am I being pulled into this scene? So just a couple other things to think about for leading lines. Questions about that? All right, well, we're doing great on time. I do want to spend a little bit more time talking about lighting. So that's our last technique that we'll cover before we get into some of the nitty gritty of our smartphones themselves. Lighting is probably, it's hard to say the most important, but it probably is the most important technique, I'll refer to it as, but the most important thing in photography. It's a good thing to remember that it can be manipulated either in your picture or afterwards by editing. And just something to learn about your particular phone too. And things change. So this is where, I don't know if you used to get a camera, a normal camera, a film camera, or even a digital camera, and you kind of had to learn what it was good at, what you like needed to put a little bit more time into. And the same concept applies, I'll say, with lighting and your phone. We're going to talk about flash in a little bit, but some smartphone cameras don't have great low light settings. I know I have an iPhone 8S, and I'm always disappointed with any pictures that are taken in a low light setting. I don't even bother taking night pictures at this point with my phone. And your phone may be different or it may be the same. And so that's just where practicing and kind of knowing its limits and knowing what's out there, what it can do is good. You're going to want to try to get as much light as possible, but that's a little bit of a caveat that we'll talk about when we talk about using light wisely. Natural light is great. I'm sitting in a very bright room right now with huge windows, and it's a sunny day. But it's also good to remember that light creates shadows. So when we take a picture of, say we're outside and it's 12 o'clock in the afternoon and it's bright and we're squinting and we're trying to take a family picture because we've just traveled somewhere fun or we're doing something fun. Sometimes the squinting is not very attractive, number one, but also that lighting creates shadows. And if the sun is overhead, it will often cast under eye shadows. And so that's just kind of things you want to keep in mind when you're using natural light or you're outside. So while natural light is wonderful, it can also work against you also. So just kind of keeping in mind the balance of the light and the shadow. I have on here, try not to rely on editing after the fact, but also don't get hung up on if it's a sunny day, you can't take any pictures, because that's not necessarily true either. Softer light is better because it doesn't create as prominent shadows or harsh shadows. And again, the more you work with this, the more pictures you take and kind of see the pros and cons, you'll see the differences.
I'd like to kind of chime in here for a second here. There's a time of the day, it's just a little bit before complete sundown and a little bit after complete sun up. A lot of photographers call it the magic hour or the golden hour because the lighting is amazing. So if you ever happen to be outside, just when the sun is starting to go down and you take some really incredible, oh, okay.
Keep going. Go ahead, Stephanie, you're doing great.
No, no, no. I didn't realize. I'm sorry. I didn't realize you were covering that. I will stop talking.
No, no. I probably should move this slide because it's a good transition to talk about that golden hour, like Stephanie said, or the magic hour. It's the softer light. It's like that, avoiding that bright, harsh sun. And that's why photographers love those times of days. You'll often, if you meet photographers, they'll go out really early in the morning or really later in the day. So that is golden hour. Just to talk about shadows a little bit more, when you're editing and maybe when you're playing around with some of the settings on your phone in your camera, if you have them, just to put it in very simple terms, highlights are the bright parts of the photo. So if you look at the picture on the right side of this person's face is in light. Those would be the highlights of the picture, and then the shadows are the darker parts of the photo, so like the left parts of her face. I always like to tell people with their phones and with their cameras to try to use fill flash, or turning your flash on is a better way to say it for a smartphone. Meaning, if you have your flash off, it'll never come on. If you have it on auto, it'll automatically detect when it needs to be on. If you have it on all the time, it'll just be on for every picture you take. And in a situation like this on the right, I'm sure this was done on purpose, but I did want to use it for illustration because even if you're outside in the sun, say I'm outside, it might be helpful to use the flash on your camera. Because if I'm wearing a hat, or again, I'm squinting because the sun is bright and it's going to cast shadows, using that flash will add additional light to the parts of your picture where it's needed. It's not going to overblow or overexpose the rest of your picture because your flash doesn't reach very far. 6 feet is about good for average flashes. But try turning that flash on, even if you're in a really bright place, to kind of counteract those shadows. I find that to be helpful with taking pictures of people in particular, especially men who like to wear ball caps, because those will often, your pictures will have half your face in the shade. And so the flash kind of helps to balance out the lighting a little bit on your face. Okay, yeah, I will change these slides because I liked that, right? I liked that earlier anyway. Okay. Here is where I do want you to try pulling out your device and finding that flash icon on your phone, your mobile device, and get comfortable with where to find it and practice turning it on, auto, off. With your iPhone users, you're going to look for that little lightning bolt icon, and you'll tap on it. And I know on my phone, I have auto on off as options. I typically have my flash off because, like I said, I don't even bother taking dark pictures anymore. Low light, excuse me. For Android, you're going to open up your camera app and again, go into your settings.
Casey, it might help if you put your camera on so people can see what if you're doing that on like a device.
Yeah, sure. Good idea. So on my phone, I opened up my camera app, and on my phone, at least, that little lightning bolt icon is up in the upper left corner. Just tap on that, and then it gives me that auto on off option. Okay, and then Android. Let me find it first. Not an Android user. And the Android, I just want to show you guys all the different options they have here. There's, and every phone's going to be a little bit different. Or every Android device is probably going to be a little bit different. Most iPhones are fairly similar, but the Android devices are all a little bit different. You know what? I don't see it anywhere. Do we have any Android users? I forget. It was mostly iPads, right?
Could it be under camera settings? Maybe it's not in the camera app proper, but maybe it's under settings in camera.
I'll have to
But that doesn't
look.
really seem to make much
No,
sense.
because you would want it kind of quick
Yeah.
access. Hmm. Okay, well, I'm gonna have to come back to that. I really want to explore some of those options too. So yeah, so just things to keep in mind as you, oops, let me turn my camera off. Just things to keep in mind as you continue to use your devices. And things to practice with. Sometimes I'll just take weird pictures just to see what it looks like. Okay, any questions about any of those techniques that we've talked about so far? Because now we're going to dive into some of the smartphone specific stuff. Okay, then we'll go ahead and move on. And like I said, feel free to just throw those questions into the chat. But let's go ahead and talk. I like to call them quirks and nuances. So some smartphones have some great features that are automatically built in that you might not have even ever heard of before using a smartphone camera. I know some of these were new to me. And then I learned that they were on my regular camera, and I just didn't even know about it. One of those is high dynamic range, or HDR. Some of you might have seen on your cameras. What HDR does essentially, and I have this example on the right-hand side of the screen, it takes 3 separate pictures, and then it basically takes the best parts of those pictures and then automatically blends them together for one picture. So in the example on the right, the largest picture of the 4 is the final output, but the 3 separate pictures on the bottom were all put together to create that. And it takes it instantaneously, and it blends it together instantaneously. To throw out a technical term, it takes 3 different pictures at 3 different exposures. And so it can capture the color without washing it out. It captures a lot of the texture without losing it at a lower or higher exposure level. And then our phones have this great software that just automatically puts them all together. I like to think of this HDR feature as when you're telling someone, oh, the pictures don't do it justice. You travel to this amazing place, or you just have this beautiful scenery and you're just in awe, and you take a picture and you're disappointed. HDR kind of fixes that a little bit for you by taking those pictures and making one really great picture to kind of help you portray the beauty that you're seeing. And it's not good, though, for every situation. It's mostly good for low light landscapes and outdoor portraits. So just keep that in mind. Again, practice using it. Try turning it on and turning it off in your settings, and see which you like better and in what situations. You'll hear me say, like, practice, practice, practice. And it's really just fun. It's just meant to be experimenting. Okay, we're not going to go through all of these in detail, but just to kind of address them or acknowledge them in case you hadn't heard of it or were kind of wondering. One of the things I love about my smartphone is that I can just, if I'm taking a picture of a person, I just tap on their face before I take the picture. And on an iPhone, for example, you're going to get a yellow square that appears around the area where you just tapped. And that's your camera basically focusing on that point because you told it to focus on that point. It's a great feature. I find myself doing it with my regular camera now, just tapping on the screen to try to focus on it, and it doesn't work that way on a regular camera. So it's gotten me kind of spoiled with focus. So that's a helpful tool just to know. And most smartphone cameras have that these days. The front-facing camera is another thing that a lot of smartphones have, and that's your selfie mode. That's the icon on the right that you'll likely see. If you're wondering, sometimes I pick up my camera to take a picture and it's my face, and I'm like, oh, it's never a flattering angle. And so I could try to quickly find that icon somewhere on my screen to flip my camera to the forward-facing or the out-facing camera rather than the front-facing camera. And a lot of us love to take selfies, and this front-facing camera has made that a lot easier these days. Okay, so Zoom is another thing that most of us will probably have on our phones. Most smartphones do the pinch and zoom technique. You know what? Let me turn my camera on for this. The pinch and zoom technique. So let me try to do an over-the-shoulder picture. If I wanted to zoom in on our COVID-19 sign, I would just start my fingers pressed together, pinch together, and then spread them. And that's going to be how I zoom and unzoom. And that's got to be quite a great feature that we have built into most cameras. Most smartphones use what's called digital zoom rather than optical zoom. If you're into photography and the technical things, and that does make a difference, but just something to keep in mind too. Okay, scene modes. Some cameras have this, particularly the Android. I continue to be impressed by the Android camera apps that have all of these features in here. If you have a camera, you might remember that dial on the top of your camera that you could turn to do different scene modes on your digital camera, but now our phones are having those built into our cameras as well too. Landscape is a really popular mode that focuses on the foreground and the background, so great for taking pictures of, you guessed it, landscape. So if I have mountains behind me and I'm standing in front of them, it's going to focus on me and also keep the mountains in the background in focus. Portrait mode has gotten to be really more of a household term than it was a few years ago, because iPhones introduced portrait mode into theirs as well. So if you see portrait, if you open up your camera app and see portrait, this is exactly what Stephanie was talking about when she was mentioning depth of field earlier. With portrait mode, you're telling it to focus on the foreground. So focus on what's in front and then blur the background or make it slightly blurry. So that's a short depth of field. That's gotten really popular because it's a great scene regardless of what type of device you're taking it from. And iPhone has just gotten a really good at guessing kind of the outline. It's not foolproof, but it's super easy to use, and it'll tell you, you're too far away, come closer, or you're too close, back up. And so it's kind of fun to play around with that. And if I don't have any people around to play, and it's better if you're standing still too for a portrait. So it's hard to take a portrait mode picture of a moving object. But if I don't have any people that are willing to sit for me while I practice portrait mode, I'll get like stuffed animals or something and just put them up somewhere and practice getting closer or backing away to see what works. Android devices have night portrait as well, some of the Android models. So again, these scenes are just really great to explore. Let me just name off a couple others that I have on here. This says low light, HDR, which we already talked about. Yeah. And then last of all, there's different effects that you can put on your phone, or that your phone already has built into it, excuse me. Sometimes we refer to these as filters, but it's more than just filters. But filters is a big one because you can take black and white pictures now. If you want more of a sepia or vintage tinted kind of look, you've got that. I feel like nowadays there's cartoon, you know, like you can take a picture of yourself with a cartoon filter so it animates you or it makes you look like a watercolor portrait. Um, it makes the pictures really bright and vivid, or it makes it quite muted. So different effects that you can do when taking the picture. Actually, I'm looking at this, the Android device that I have in front of me, and they have one called Beautification. All right, and what I'm just looking at what it does, it makes your lips, I'm tapping on it. It makes your lips redder. It looks like it makes your skin smoother and your eyes bigger, among other things. So it's all interesting things that we have built into our devices. Okay, so how to find out what your phone has. Start in your camera app, especially those of you with an Android device, but if you don't see much there, you want to know what else is there, go into your settings app. Like I know my iPhone, that HDR setting was in there. So I had to go into my settings and then the camera part of my settings and go to the HDR and turn that HDR on or off. Not all phones have all features, of course. If this is something important to you, if you really start to get into photography and the different smartphone features that you have, think about that when you purchase your next phone. Some phones are made for picture taking. The Google Pixel, I believe, is like a really, has a really great camera and a lot of great camera settings. I'm blanking on some of the other Android ones. I know iPhone, that's a pretty big priority for a lot of people with their iPhones. And so the newer the camera, the nicer that the settings and the features get in iPhone as well. Stephanie, you have a newer iPhone, right?
Yes, I have an iPhone 11.
Okay.
So one generation off.
And I think, like, just to give an example, the iPhone 11, if you could take a selfie with portrait mode, correct?
Yeah, actually, it's funny because I'm messing around with that right now, and
We're on the same page today.
I mean, the subject could be better, but it's, for what it's supposed to do, it actually is looking really good, and I'm actually pretty impressed.
Yeah, but I don't have that on my iPhone 8.
Right.
So just as you have to kind of explore what your personal device has.
Well, I mean,
And
it's only on the back on the back camera.
that's right.
Because I was on vacation and I did some selfies in portrait mode, and I could do that with the rear camera.
Yep.
Not the front camera like I can with the 11.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can even change your depth of field too, right? You can make it less blurry in the background and then more blurry in the background.
Oh yeah, there's so much that you can do with the phones that it's just so much fun what you can do. You don't even need a whole bunch of fancy apps 90% of the time. You just, need to play around and, explore.
Right, exactly. Or a fancy camera.
Oh yeah, that's what I tell my Girl Scouts all the time. It doesn't matter whether you have like remember Ansel Adams took some of his best pictures with a brownie box camera. So, you can create wonders with what you have in your pocket.
Great point. Great example too. Okay, let's go ahead. We are finishing up now. Just to kind of address all of your awesome pictures that you're going to start taking and all the ones you've taken in the past, what to do with them. We'll teach another class on this at some point, hopefully soon, but because there's a lot of different options, as you can see, and a lot to cover. But the great thing about your phone is that you can text those pictures to the people you want to share them with pretty easily. And you can email them if you don't want to text. There's also photo sharing websites. Some of these names might be familiar to you. I know Flickr is a really big one that's been around for a long time. Shutterfly is really big. Like with my mom happens to use Shutterfly a lot because she makes photo albums or photo books. Shutterfly is a company that will print them and bind the books for you. So the modern photo album, Snapfish, I believe, does the same. Social media, of course, is a great way to share your pictures with all of your friends and family. If you want to save your pictures longer term or use them, have them backed up somewhere, the cloud is a great place to do that. Google Photos has unlimited photo storage if you have a Google account. So if you have a Gmail address, you've got free unlimited photo storage. iCloud, if you have an iPhone, you get a certain amount of storage and then you can just pay per month for extra storage space. And Dropbox is another cloud storage provider. And then you can't beat printing. I still have printed pictures that of my family around my desk. And so if you still want to get your pictures printed, there's places that you can go to have that done as well. Walgreens, CVS. Some people can do it and then they have them mailed to them. They upload it to the company's website and then they print them and mail them to you. So there's all different options. And if you're interested in one of those, please let me know. If you don't have any questions today and you find yourself playing around with this and having a question later, I'm going to email you all these slides next week, probably. I'm going to upload it to YouTube and email you the slides. So you'll have my contact information too, if I can answer any questions. And if I don't know, I love to research the stuff. Like I'm going to find out this Android flash on this device. So feel free to reach out via email too. But just to quickly wrap up what we covered, we talked about those composition techniques, which again, you don't need any equipment to do that except something with a shutter button. We've got rule of thirds we talked about, which is that tic-tac-toe board on your screen and the concept of putting the subject or the focus or the weight of your picture into a third of your frame, either vertical or horizontal third. We talked about perspective and framing and getting lower or getting higher or putting something in the foreground to make the background a little bit more interesting. We talked about leading lines like bridges and that hiking bridge, the trail, train tracks to kind of do a bold image. People do that a lot with black and white photography too. I don't think I mentioned that, but that's that bold, it's striking, so that it doesn't really rely on the color. And then of course we talked about lighting and making sure we experiment and understand what our phones are and aren't capable of doing. We talked a little bit, we didn't really do the hands-on of the exploring our camera app settings, but we did talk about different options that are in there and then some tips and tricks for smartphone specific photography. I do have this little additional slide in here for this class. Just as a reminder to practice, again, I know I said this already, but there's no harm in taking pictures with your phone. The worst thing that's gonna happen is you're gonna run out of storage space. And if we're gonna, teach a class on that too. So join us soon for something about that. I like to remind people that we have a few great local photography clubs too. It's a good excuse to make yourself practice by joining a club, and a lot of times they take field trips to fun locations. Oftentimes they'll have speakers, so a nature photographer. I've gone to a couple about drone photography, which I'm really interested in, but haven't taken a step in that direction yet myself. So just a good way to meet other people with similar interests, but also learn new things and get exposed to new ideas. I'd encourage you to start paying attention to other people's pictures. What do you like about that picture? What do you not like about that picture? You decide and then try to emulate that. And the same thing goes for following photographers on social media. I get really inspired or get better ideas of framing or places to shoot by following photographers on Instagram, and especially Florida photographers, since we have a unique landscape here too to practice with. So just a few things to encourage you in your smartphone photography quest. With that being said, I am going to stop sharing my slides and ask if there's any questions. Put my video back on too. Any questions in the chat, Stephanie?
No, we don't have anything in the chat right now.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks again, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Like I said, I'll mail you all this stuff next week, hopefully, if I can put it all together and get it up on YouTube fast enough. But thanks for joining us, and stay tuned for more classes to come.